I'm Jacob Chandler, and I'm a Boy Scout. Today is August 15, 2015, and I will be interviewing Earl Peavy. He is a veteran of the Vietnam War. He is also a veteran of the Cold War era. This interview is part of my Eagle Scout Service project. The veterans of LaSalle Parish often have stories that go untold. The LaSalle Veterans Exhibit and the interviews are part of my Eagle Scout Service project. The LaSalle Cultural Center of Jena, Louisiana will display my LaSalle Veterans Exhibit. Our mission is to preserve our LaSalle Parish heritage. Today I'm interviewing Earl Peavy. He is my grandfather. Granddad, what war and eras did you serve in?
I served during the Vietnam conflict, or Vietnam War, which was, my era of service was in the late 1960s in that conflict. Also, I served during the period of time of the Cold War era, which extended for a far greater period of time. But the Cold War era was underway at the time that I was in the military.
Yes, sir. What branch of service were you in?
I served in the United States Navy. I served on active duty about 5.5 years. I served in naval aviation. I was a flyer. And in the Naval Aviation Program, I was a naval flight officer and a navigator bombardier.
Yes, sir. What was your rank?
My rank, I eventually had a total of 3 ranks, as many people do. My initial rank was as an ensign. I was an officer, a naval officer. After completing the officer candidate school at Pensacola, then I was commissioned at the first rank as an ensign. Later on, some months later, I was promoted to lieutenant junior grade, and then eventually during my combat tour, I was promoted to the rank of a Navy lieutenant, or O3, which is equivalent to perhaps your Marine captain.
Yes. Would you show us with these maps where you served at during the Vietnam conflict?
Yes. During the Vietnam conflict and the time which underwent a period of about 10 years, but my period of service there was during the 1968 era. If we draw our attention to your display, to your map, this is a map that you brought up for us of the greater Pacific Ocean in the blue. And of course we see on the side here is the United States that we're all familiar with. And across the Pacific Ocean is the greater Asian mainland. So if we take the Pacific Ocean and look in the far southwest corner of the Pacific Ocean, we will find the South China Sea and the Tonkin Gulf, which are in the immediate proximity of Indochina, or as we now call them, Vietnam and Laos and those related countries in the of the Vietnam vicinity proper. This area here was often referred to as Indochina for 200 or 300 years, and as we mentioned, is in the southwest corner of the greater Pacific Ocean. The immediate vicinity on the mainland, we will articulate this being China up in the gray color, the greater mainland, and then immediately adjoining it in the pink is North Vietnam, or North Vietnam as it existed during the time of my service. At that same time, there was a country known as South Vietnam to the south of it. Vietnam was a divided country. It was once Vietnam. Then it was partitioned into North Vietnam and to South Vietnam. And immediately adjacent to North Vietnam is the Tonkin Gulf.
Yes, sir.
This display that you brought up for us here, that you've lined out ahead, is a expanded version of the South China Sea in the blue. The greater Pacific Ocean is up and to the right. Over on the left is the North Vietnam and the South Vietnam and the Tonkin Gulf that are in the immediate proximity to the greater South China Sea. The South China Sea separates the Asian mainland from the group of islands that we know of as the Philippine Islands.
Yes, sir. Now I'll take us to a map of the Soviet Union.
All right, yes. All right. In our previous discussions, during the Cold War era, that part of that my service included, and the Cold War era extended for a far longer period of time, from 1945 until about 1991. So my period of service occurred during a portion of that greater Cold War era. Following my tour in combat employment down in the Vietnam conflict, then I was assigned to our squadron went to operations in conflict with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The Cold War era was a non-declared war that lasted for a long period of time, and your map is demonstrating Russia and many of the Soviet Union countries, or which were de facto opponents of the United States and free Europe. And the Cold War was an issue militarily that was for the purpose of containing that Soviet Union and its satellite countries militarily. Our government kept a military posture at all times to be able to respond to the Soviet Union in event that they would declare hostilities. This is Russia and Siberia and the related countries in North Europe near the Arctic Circle. Now down to the south, if you would go to your Mediterranean map. As we take a look at this map you've selected for us, we will see the Mediterranean Sea. And we're all familiar with that with geography from our schools. To the north of the Mediterranean Sea is Europe as we know those countries. To the south is Africa. And during the Cold War era, this vicinity that my pointer is at, the Black Sea, was warm water. And that is where most of the Soviet Union's naval military fleet was home-based. And for them to get out and to get into the greater oceans, Atlantic and Pacific, they had to come through the Mediterranean Sea. Our government, through its U.S. Navy, kept a battle group, a carrier and related vessels in the Mediterranean Sea continuously so as to shadow and monitor any Soviet military naval shipping that came and went from this Black Sea area out into the Atlantic Ocean and Pacific Ocean. So my unit served for a period of time in monitoring those movements.
Yes, sir. Granted, where did you first live, or in LaSalle Parish?
Okay, in LaSalle Parish, of course I was born in LaSalle Parish, and I was born at home in my residence, about approximately 2 miles outside of Trout. Of course, Trout being in the Gina vicinity, but along Highway 8 at the family home in 1942.
Yes, sir. How old were you when you first entered military training?
I was 22 years old, almost 23. That was in August of 1965. I graduated from Louisiana State University in August of 1965. I had previously applied for entry into the Navy's flight program, officer candidate school and flight program, but to qualify for that program, one had to be a graduate of an accredited university within a certain field of scientific endeavor. So upon graduation, I commenced actual training within a couple of months in November of 1965.
Yes, sir. Why did you choose the Navy branch to serve in?
First, my goal and ambition at that time, through high school and from as a child, I wanted to be in the military. I wanted to be a military flyer, aviator. I was more familiar with the Air Force, but I knew certainly of the naval aviation. As a matter of fact, at Louisiana State University, while I was a student, for 3 years, I was a candidate in the Air Force's Reserve Officer Training Program. However, the Navy came forth with a program that would be available that would give me a much higher likelihood of being able to get into a combat flying unit at that time in that era. So I ceased my Air Force ROTC program and signed up for the Navy Officer Candidate program that would be activated contingent upon me successfully graduating and getting a degree. So primarily I wanted to fly in military aviation, and once I saw the things that the Navy was doing in those days, particularly from aircraft carriers and ships, I felt like that more suited my interest of what I wanted to do with my life at that time, rather than the Air Force program.
Yes, sir. Well, can you show us on the map where you first trained at?
Yes.
Like in relation to Louisiana?
All right, and as we talked earlier, you have brought up for us to start with a general map of the United States, and as I just pointed out, I'm going to put my pointer down here near Baton Rouge, Louisiana, since that is where I finished Louisiana State University and signed up with the U.S. Navy to a contract for a period of service with them. And then I traveled, they sent me to Pensacola, Florida. Pensacola, Florida is the home of naval aviation. That's where naval aviators arrive and begin their careers. First we became officers, then we conducted a certain amount of our initial primary flight training out of Pensacola. Then following those months, I was sent, you might bring up your map of Florida there for us. Now, if you could scroll over to Pensacola, and I'll put my pointer on Pensacola. Pensacola is just across out of Alabama into Florida, and following those approximately a year at Pensacola, then I went to Georgia.
Yes, sir.
And your map of Georgia, I will articulate over on the coast of Georgia, in the town of Brunswick, Georgia. I went for advanced navigation and instrument training at Brunswick, Georgia, for a few months. Then I was sent back to Florida. And if you bring up your map here, and we will look at in central Florida, near Orlando, that we're all familiar with. The town of Sanford, Florida, 10 or 15 miles from Orlando, was a naval air station. And I was sent there to transition to the type of aircraft that I would be flying as a navigator on, and then to join my fleet unit. So I was located in Florida twice, and then I was sent back to Georgia, to Albany, Georgia. Our families moved there when I deployed to sea, and then when we returned 10 months later, I went back to Albany, Georgia, and we continued to live there 3.5 years at that naval air station.
Yes, sir. Well, now that was like?
Yes. Let's say our training, of course there's a lot of phases of our training, as one would know. But generally speaking, the first 4 months, though it was naval aviation, we were not allowed to get anywhere close to an airplane or a helicopter. We went through officer candidate school. The flying assignments I was striving for required one to be a naval officer. So when I completed that 4 months, that time was spent all, we won't say like summer camp, but it's a basic training where we learn drill, learn calisthenics, learn naval history, where we live in the barracks, and we live a very hurried life. I might say I was surprised to find out when I arrived that the first 4 months the training would be done by the U.S. Marine Corps. And that was a shock to me, and I grew to like it later, but it was a surprising thing.
Yes, sir.
The Marine Corps does things in a very harsh manner. So from that training, after becoming an officer, then became flight training. And me going through the Navigator Bombardier program, of course I went through as an officer then, and so for approximately another year, a year and a half, I went to various phases of aviation, weather, aerodynamics, learned to fly aircraft, learned to do navigation, various types, learned instruments. And this training, of course, I was already an officer, and I lived at my apartment. My wife and I lived at our apartment. I had been married 2 years whenever I entered the Navy.
Yes.
And so it's roughly 24 hours a day with 5 or 6 or 7 hours off at various parts of the day to go home and change clothes and then return.
Yes, sir. Well, did you have any specialty training or survival school that you went to?
Yes, I did. Overall in the Navy, I attended at least 4 survival schools with emphasis on various aspects of survival. Initially, during the training program of the Navy, the flight training program, I attended survival school down in Eglin Air Force Base, which is in Florida, for 5 or 6 days. And in that we learned to live in the woods, much like Boy Scouts do. I had been a Boy Scout and like the Boy Scouts, worked at Boy Scout summer camp for many years. So I acclimated to that first survival training pretty good. Then my second survival training, I went to Brunswick, Maine, cold weather survival for a week, to where one learns to live on their own in cold weather, in the snow, and at the end of that time then to serve or to be picked up and to make 3 days in the prisoner of war camp, to learn a little bit about what it might be like to be a field deputy. Following that, then I went to survival training in the Philippines, where we learned to be picked up by boats out of the sea and to learn to survive at sea for a day or so in rafts of this nature. Then the fourth survival program was also in the Philippines, where we learned jungle survival. And we learned to spend about 4 days in the jungle and to acclimate how we might keep ourselves alive in the event we found ourselves having to eject or become located into hostile areas, since Vietnam had much jungle area and much similar harsh type of timberland.
Yes, sir. Did you feel like all this training adequately prepared you for your service?
Yes. At the time, I felt like it might have been overkill at the time it was happening, because I was in preparation stage. And but after my combat deployment began, and after the first 3 or 4 days, I began to realize that it takes a long time to train a person to have even a rudimentary knowledge of survival under hostile conditions. And so I became more appreciative of that during my combat deployment, when on my ship of our ship's operations, the USS America, of that 10 months, we had 26 airplanes out of 95 shot down, and we lost 27 crew. Most of those airplanes were two-seat, 2 personnel. So we lost about 27 or so flyers were shot down. Some were killed, some were POW, captured, 1 or 2 drowned. And so it was during that time when some of those failed to return, and you learn the circumstances, that you learn to appreciate a little more what the Navy has done to prepare you for perhaps giving you some kind of a fair chance of survival.
Yes, sir. Well, what all positions did you serve in during the Vietnam conflict?
What all positions?
Yes, sir, John.
Right. Basically, I served much as most naval officers in aviation. I had two jobs. In those days, it may or may not be that way now, but in those days, approximately 45, 50 years ago, naval flight officers and naval pilots had 2 jobs. One was your flying assignment. That was your primary assignment in your contract to the government, to fly aircraft in support of combat operations. And in my case, I was in a reconnaissance unit.
Yes, sir.
I was a navigator and a bombardier, and then my security clearance let me go to a reconnaissance unit, of which I became a specialist in reconnaissance.
Yes, sir.
And that is how I served most of my time as a reconnaissance attack navigator, or basically a flight officer. Our airplanes were two-seated, pilot, and the RAN, reconnaissance attack navigator. And that's my tasking and flying. And that's the bulk of your day. My second job, equally important, was Navy policy that all flying officers had a ground job. And I, with a background in engineering, the Navy assigned me to be one of the 4 maintenance officers in our squadron. Our squadron had 7 airplanes. Let me correct that, 6 airplanes and 7 crews. We had also 260 other personnel. And the Navy squadron did its own maintenance of its own aircraft. It's a self-contained unit, does its own payroll, does its own administrative, does its own maintenance. So officers have different kind of ground jobs. My ground job, all of my time in the Navy, was as a assistant maintenance officer.
Yes, sir. Well, can you describe some of the gear and equipment that was issued to you?
Yes, and let's say I'm going to call it personal gear for field operations, and then I'll contrast that with uniforms.
Yes, sir.
Of course, like other Navy personnel, I had winter uniforms with dress blues. In summer, I wore dress whites, white trousers, white shirts. Then also at sea, during the work day, I wore khaki trousers and shirt with a bridge cover that we're familiar with, the big headpiece. Now that is in performing your ground duties and in your administrative duties. Performing my field operation, my flight gear. Someone else doing field operations might have a different kind of field equipment. I had flight gear equipment, personal equipment issued to me. And it was basically, I saw a photograph of, you had earlier there, of a kind of a green flight suit. You showed me earlier.
Yes, sir.
We had flight suits similar to this. As you pointed out earlier, I think this is an Air Force one, but our Navy folks, we use the same type, these colors. That's flame retardant, and it's a pair of coveralls.
Yes, sir.
Of course, we had symbols like the American flag that we wore. Normally, during combat operations, we did not wear any of our rank or our other insignia.
Yes, sir.
And there were times in reconnaissance, in the Cold War operations, where we wore no insignia and where we carried no identification. But that was unique to reconnaissance.
Yes, sir.
Because of the uniqueness of a certain mission that might be performed. But in the Vietnam area, we wore primarily an American flag, and then we had our, we'll say dog tags, our ID tags, 2 little tags with your name and blood type and service number. These things to identify you, required by the Geneva Convention. Also, personal flight gear. I have a picture that I'll show you that I took of the pilot that I flew with, my commanding officer for 2 years. We were walking on the ship on our way to man aircraft for our mission in 1968. I quickly shot this little photograph of him. That's the back of his head. We're walking along the catwalk. This is an airborne tanker about getting ready to be launched off.
Yes, sir.
And that little bag he's got over his shoulder has got his helmet and his knee pad in it. We wore helmets, oxygen masks, visors, as you often see on TV. In our type aircraft, we wore those from takeoff to landing at all times. Also, we wore, we will call it a torso harness. You wear it around your waist, over your shoulders, and in it is a survival kit and a life preserver that's collapsed. And if you have to eject or ditch into the water, you can pull the handles on the life preserver and it inflates around your waist. Also, during certain times, we carried sidearms, 9mm automatic pistols, and we carried that in our flight, our survival jackets. And we also wore boots that were lace-up boots about half knee high.
Yes, sir.
Of course, sometimes up in cold weather operations, up in the North Atlantic and in the North Pacific and in the Mediterranean, across the winter when I was there, we also had leather jackets, fur collar leather jackets that we wore over our flight suit but under our survival suit.
Yes, sir.
And I brought this to show you here. My house burned some years ago, so all of my uniforms and the things that I kept since my time in service were lost in that house fire. Except this is my knife, my military issue survival knife, Peavy EW. I've kept that over 50-something years, and I carried it in my torso harness.
Yes, sir.
Fortunately, it was to my good fortune that I never had to use that.
Yes, sir.
Upon completion of my tour, I had to turn in my sidearm, my pistol.
Yes, sir. Can you also explain to us about the aircraft that you flew?
Yes, the aircraft that I was a member of the two-person crew. It was a twin-engine jet. It was a relatively large aircraft. It was called the Vigilante, built by the North American Aviation Company.
Yes, sir.
And I have a photograph of one that was used for training purposes. During my training days, they gave us, and this is on when it's being launched by the catapult off of the ship. It's a big swept wing jet, has 2 jet engines, has 2 crews, a pilot, and the RAN, the Reconnaissance Attack Navigator. They sit in tandem seat behind each other. Certainly on land, on runways, but it's also a carrier-based, aircraft carrier-based, and has a tail hook to arrest and land on the ship. We served on the USS America, which was a large aircraft carrier that had about 96 or 97 airplanes plus 2 or 3 helicopters.
Yes, sir.
They certainly have big carriers like that nowadays. This airplane carried no guns. It was primarily for reconnaissance because it was it had a lot of speed. It was capable of about 1.5 times the speed of sound at low level. Up at high altitude, it could achieve approaching twice the speed of sound.
Yes, sir.
It had relatively long range with its internal fuel, and it also was capable of being refueled in the air by tankers. So it was a very fast airplane, and it also had the capability to carry 2 nuclear weapons. We trained for delivery of those nuclear weapons. Certainly never had to use them, but the Navy designed this airplane to be able to drop special type weapons, not conventional ones.
Yes, sir.
The radar system and the computer system was designed for nuclear delivery and for reconnaissance. So, for example, on landing and on takeoff, the speed was 175 miles per hour.
Yes, sir.
About 170 knots. That's about as slow as you could keep it airborne. However, once it got up out of its landing and takeoff configuration, it would readily fly well up above the speed of sound, which is around 750 miles per hour. So 800, 900, 1,000 miles per hour.
Yes,
Wow.
sir.
We did not fly at that speed everywhere we went, of course. But on combat missions, we would fly at those speeds above the speed of sound.
Yes, sir. Well, with your gear and equipment, also your airplane, was it always reliable whenever you used it?
Yes. Now, airplane, the gear is, the personal gear is very reliable.
Yes, sir.
Of course. We had personal sidearms, personal survival vests, and things, and a person learns to customize that to satisfy themselves. Of course, we had parachutes that were part of the aircraft. The airplanes, we talked about them being reliable. It was the first advanced fly-by-wire, meaning all electronic military airplane in the Navy. We have many of them nowadays, but it was a fly-by-wire computer-operated airplane, and which was very advanced at that time. Now, it also had powerful engines that could propel it up to 1.5 times the speed of sound. So therefore, it takes a lot of maintenance to do repairs and to do servicing to keep engines and electronics functioning in their capability that they need to function in to do combat missions.
Yes, sir.
So I would say it had a high degree of reliability, but that is based upon it being maintained mechanically continuous day to day to day.
All right. Well, Granddaddy, what all medals and decorations did you run or wore?
All right. Yes. Okay. The ones I had, we took a look on your chart earlier,
Yes, sir.
and I will point out mine is very similar to what many others had. But to begin with, if the camera could zoom to this point, I think this is the National Service Medal. Anyone who served in the military during that era, whether they were located in Vietnam or in support of Vietnam operations. I was never in Vietnam or on land. My operations were always from at sea and missions flown over North Vietnam. But anyone serving even in the U.S. or at some other station at our bases in Germany, Mediterranean Sea, Japan, wherever, received the National Defense Medal. Those who were in support and involved in direct operations in Vietnam, in South Vietnam, and in the air war over North Vietnam, we were awarded the Vietnam Service Medal, kind of like a campaign medal, because it was a particular zone of hostilities. So I also received that one, but so did a few 100,000 others who served in the Vietnam conflict.
Yes, sir.
Now this next one here, I think it is called the Air Medal. The Air Medal is awarded for various reasons, but one of the primary reasons is for performing a certain number of combat missions over hostile territory.
Yes, sir.
And I received 6 Air Medals because the way it's computed per Air Medal, I flew on 75 combat missions over North Vietnam, and that translated to 6 Air Medals.
Yes, sir.
So many others received that depending on how many missions they flew.
Yes, sir.
10 or 20 or 50. In some cases, a few flew over 100. I flew 75. Then the next, I think this demonstrates like the Bronze Star issued by our Army.
Yes, sir.
The Navy issues a similar medal called the Navy Commendation Medal. It's this one on this end of the camera. The Navy Commendation Medal, I received that. It is normally awarded for specific meritorious and extraordinary performance and on a specific mission.
Yes, sir.
Or specific incident or event into a high-value target area assigned by the Navy Department, and that involved going into a significantly hostile environment as far as air defenses by the opponent. And for one mission particularly that I performed with the pilot, I received the commendation medal.
Yes, sir. Well, on a different note, could you describe a typical day in service?
A typical day in the service. Well, there are a lot of different kinds of days in the service, particularly in the Navy, and particularly for reconnaissance flight officers who are also maintenance officers. And that depends a lot on whether you're on shore or whether you're being deployed at sea. We were home-based in Albany, Georgia, after training our all reconnaissance squadrons at that time, where our families lived. And we did flight operations there, and we did maintenance there. But all of that is like in Boy Scouts, is preparing for summer camp. Much of our studies is to prepare for when we're going to camp, where we're going to execute these skills that we're learning. So the Navy's life is at sea. So I will describe my experience relative to when I'm at sea doing what the country has hired me to do.
Yes, sir.
And that on a combat tour. An example day of when we would say when the ship is on the line, that means that it's conducting combat operations over hostile territory, bombing strikes, other types of missions. That certainly involves reconnaissance. Reconnaissance is a primary component of the Navy's Air Intelligence Department, so that targets can be identified, targets can be assessed by the Defense Department, and then assigned for prosecution by the attack units. So an example day is usually about 16 hours awake to 18 hours awake. That would be 90% of the days. There are some days that are 24 hours, 30 hours. But that would represent maybe 90% of the days. And if one, operations go 24 hours a day. But if one had a mission scheduled for 7 a.m., supposedly, for a daylight mission, realizing that missions are flown daylight and night. And it's rotated among the crews. But to launch at 7 a.m. for a 2-hour or 2.5-hour combat mission, I would normally be getting up about before 3 a.m. Somewhere around 2 a.m. to shave and to brush my teeth and to get into my clean flight gear, flight clothes. Not your survival equipment yet, not your helmets yet, but your coveralls, so to speak. And then down to the wardroom, or the cafeteria, in other words, for early breakfast. And then by 3 a.m., I would go to the Flight Planning Center, which for reconnaissance people is in the Intelligence Center.
Yes, sir.
To go and to meet the pilot. There, in my unit, we always flew with the same pilot. And the pilot flew with the same RAM. So that, because you practice your survival skills together in case you go down together.
Yes, sir.
So we always flew with the same person. And I flew with the commanding officer of the unit, Commander David Robert Fall, from Asheville, North Carolina. He was married and he had 5 children. I was married and had 2 children at that time. Commander Fall was approximately 20 years older than I. He had been around a long time.
Yes, sir.
Very experienced. But we would meet and we would receive a 30-minute briefing of where our target assignments were for that next mission. And in reconnaissance, it's normally not one target. It is a series of targets. And hopefully you can get over and accomplish the surveillance and recovery of at least maybe 5 out of 7 targets. Intercept or ground fire or something might prevent you from getting 1 or 2 of them. So we don't go for just one target. But once we had that list of targets and a list from the intelligence folks of approximately where the expected anti-aircraft and surface-to-air missile sites were located near our target area, then he and I, we would go about 4 a.m. for about 2 hours of flight planning. And where we plan how we will enter and travel over the target territory across the country and back, and plan our refueling and plan with our fighter escort where we will make turns and climbs and so forth. And then by 6 a.m. we go to the ready room to put on our personal gear, survival equipment, our knee pads and things. And then we receive a final short briefing there of the ship's weather, the ship's location, and where the ship will be when we return. Unlike an air base or an airport, that ship will not sit and stay in the same place. It will be gone in some hours. So when you return, you want to return to where it's going to be, not where you left it. And that can be a significant part of mission planning.
Yes, sir.
Also, we received final briefing on survival and where the search and rescue helicopters will be located in the event that we would have a problem and have to eject over the target areas, where we might expect that survival search and rescue to come from, whether it be the Navy coming from the sea or whether it would be our Air Force friends coming from Thailand. So then at 6:30, the ship says, "Flight crews, man your aircraft." And we go up and we get into the cockpit and we start the turn up of the checklist to launch at 7 a.m. And us and our fighter escort.
Yes, sir.
So then we would probably return in about 2.5 hours. We would then have an hour of debriefing. Make notes in the event the electronics don't work for some reason. Then we would take a bath, clean up, and then go do our ground job.
Yes, sir.
Down to the maintenance spaces. As one of the 4 maintenance officers for a maintenance department of 180 people. I had duties and assignments there, much like engineers have for oil companies. So, by the time one accomplishes those tasks, it has now been 16, 17, 18 hours since I awoke.
Yes, sir.
And then I go get 6 or 7 more hours worth of sleep and rest, and get up and prepare to do it again. That would be kind of a typical day with my squadron on the line and me doing the 2 jobs the Navy has assigned me to do.
Granddaddy, are there any particular missions that stood out to you?
Yes. Of course, there were a lot of flights in those years. I accumulated a little over 1,000, roughly 1,100 flight hours.
Yes, sir.
Just in my one tour, counting my training and my operational at sea time. So there were many flights, and slightly over 300 carrier landings during that period of time. But a flight that stands out to me, that I was very thankful of the way it turned out eventually. During the Vietnam conflict, and during a hot summer night, it gets to be warm temperatures in the South Pacific during the summer, and hot, humid, and we would be oftentimes soaking wet with sweat when we would return from a mission. Not always so much from fear, though fear is a very good phenomenon to keep in mind, because it helps you not take things for granted, and it helps you perform your task with your attention devoted solely to your task, which is very necessary not only for your own survival, but also for the survival of someone else that you are a flight crew member with. So, as I mentioned previously, that we were 2-seat aircraft, and we always functioned as a crew, and even went to training, survival schools together, and we learned to try to survive and function as a two-man crew. But one particular mission that the way it turned out was a great relief to me, ultimately, was following a night mission. At night, we flew by ourselves, low level. We did not carry cameras at night. We had cameras that could take photographs at night with a flasher system, but that invites ground fire. But we used infrared or thermal mapping of troop concentrations and power plant facilities, roads and barges and railways and things like that at night. But at night in reconnaissance, we flew by ourselves. We did not carry a fighter escort with us because at the high speeds, there's too much danger of running together. Whereas in the daylight, at high speeds, you're able to see each other. So as we returned from a sortie that went all the way across to North Vietnam and over to the North Vietnamese Laotian border near the city of Vinh Son, a city that was built in the curve of a river, always very heavily defended, always over near the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was a major routing network for North Vietnam to move troop supplies and materials to South Vietnam. We were to do reconnaissance of about 80 or 90 miles of road section that night, infrared or thermal, and we took much anti-aircraft fire. Of course, we were normally above speed of sound, we were fast, and we were very low, as we did day and night. But that was a particularly long mission, and we were nearly out of fuel before we got back to the coast of the Tonkin Gulf. And at high speeds versus optimum flying, you might have optimum flying and managing of the fuel systems. You might have 2.5 or 3 hours worth of fuel at maximum speed in afterburners. You might have 18 minutes of fuel.
Yes, sir.
So fuel management is a very important issue under combat conditions. And normally we would top off on fuel from the tanker just before heading overland. Because overland we would be always at high speed. And we had a certain number of minutes. And you can only weave and turn, and you must stay very close to the choreography of the flight planning. Fuel exhaustion will get you.
Yes, sir.
In the United States, you land at the nearest airport. That's big enough. Civilian airport if necessary. Over North Vietnam, the nearest airport is 300, 400 miles further away, back out at sea. So if you run out of fuel, though you have avoided anti-aircraft fire or any surface-to-air missile fire that might have occurred, fuel starvation will be your end. Because in a matter of minutes, mismanagement, and you will be ejected in the dark over hostile territory. So that means perhaps in an hour you will be a POW or worse. So therefore, fuel management is critical. And fuel management is an issue between the pilot and navigation and the computer system and the speeds and the turns and how much time did you take in the turns and the numbers of seconds. You don't fly directly to a target and turn and fly directly back as you might in an airliner. You weave and turn at high speed to keep their radar tracking systems and gun systems from locking onto. They are there. They already know you're there. You're not going to surprise anyone. The war's been going on for years. And they were using the best radar tracking systems, anti-aircraft fire, and surface-to-air missile systems that the Soviet Union, Russia could manufacture. They were a surrogate of the Soviet Union. They operated Soviet radars, Soviet anti-aircraft systems, Soviet missiles. Soviet MiGs were flown by their pilots and a few Russian pilots for training purposes. So we were dealing with de facto Soviet hardware and tactics and a Soviet ally. And we knew that. But fuel starvation will be what likely gets you on 7 or 8 times out of 10 if you follow your techniques to avoid getting hit by ground power. Fuel starvation is a crew factor, a mismanagement factor, or a get in trouble and then not have enough fuel to get out or get back to Thailand to the nearest Air Force base. We ran into much difficulty avoiding missile tracking. And we had to much depart on 3 or 4 occasions from our choreographed flight schedule in order to break locks on missile fire. We were down to about, when we crossed the coast, back to open water. And remember, the open waters are also a lot of North Vietnamese fishermen. So just because you are over water doesn't mean you're safe. But as we called feet wet, meaning to the AWACS far away, monitoring our movement and the air sea rescue, which meant we had crossed back over into water about 3 a.m. in the morning. Hot, sultry night. And low level, we were down to about 8 to 9 minutes worth of fuel to our best ability to compute. So we immediately started climbing and calling for the tanker. And the tanker is maybe 80 or 90 miles away. The tanker can't afford to get too close to the North Vietnamese coast or they'll get shot down by North Vietnamese fighters. Tankers do not carry armor. But as we started climbing and heading towards the tanker and the AWACS, the voice of the young man named Andy in the AWACS, he was a naval officer, I knew him, he was a friend, one of that 40. As Andy gives us steering information, we knew where we were headed, but the tanker did not know where we were. But as he gave steering to the tanker pilot, their call sign 10 pin, and our call sign Flint River. 10 pin's words were something like, steady Flint, I'm coming to you. So therefore, we did not have to wander around hunting the tanker at night when we were down to a few minutes of fuel.
Yes, sir.
He came towards us. Those were, since I handle communication in our aircraft, I'm doing the communicating. And Commander Fowler is saying, how many minutes? And man, the computer, we're estimating how many minutes. And we're wet with sweat. And if we flame out, then we've got to eject because we did not have a high survival rate to ditch our type aircraft. And so it would be a dark night and far away from home in the water if we had to do that. But we came within, we went to our position and the tanker said, hold what you have, Flint. I'm pulling alongside you and I'm going to pull in front of you, since you have to get behind the tanker. So we did not have to maneuver. If we would have had to maneuver or maybe made a 30-mile or 25-mile orbit or something like that, we would have ran out of fuel with the tanker nearby. But he joined on us in the dark. And we were so happy to hear the word from old Tin Pin. Yes, sir. A very steady voice. We knew those people. They were from our ship. We refueled from them going into target and coming off of target. But that was one of the most spooky times, I think, that I encountered.
Yes, sir. Do you remember any particularly humorous or unusual event that happened during your service?
Yes, I would like to share that with you there. That not, and certainly in other branches of the military, anytime you have people, you're going to have humorous events. In companies, in church, in Boy Scout, in community, and definitely in the United States Navy. Because you have a lot of people thrown together there that are not all just alike. Yes. And they have different perspectives on things. But, so there are many. But one of particular of significance to me, and it occurred during the combat deployment off Vietnam in 1968. A young man that worked for me, matter of fact, in maintenance department. There were about 60 of them that worked for me. An electronic technician, about 3 years out of high school, Navy enlisted young man, repairman, worked on aircraft radios and communication systems. His name was Giddings. Mr. Giddings was very he showed a lot of interest in his work. He was very faithful. He was very dutiful. His first deployment ever in the Navy. 3 years ago he'd been in high school. And Mr. Giddings worked up on the flight deck where the aircraft were doing maintenance. That was where his job assignment was. Well, now on a flight deck when there are operations underway, remember there's 95 airplanes on a carrier, or in those days, 3 or 4 helicopters. And when there are flight operations going on, maybe to launch 25 or 30 of them, all turning up engines at the same time, there is a lot of noise, a lot of heat, a lot of blast going on. And Mr. Giddings, doing his duties, he took a shortcut from the aircraft he was servicing over to the elevator to go down into the maintenance spaces. As he took that trip over, which was not the proper route to go, Mr. Giddings passed, as he came close to the edge of the ship, one of the aircraft that was turning up for a night mission and taxiing up to the catapult. As it pivoted, the blast from its twin engines blew Mr. Giddings over the side. He wasn't close, he didn't get burned, but yes, it's the wind blast.
Oh, wow.
The wind blast blew Mr. Giddings over the side, well out over the water.
Yes, sir.
At night. Now, immediately the Navy's got some good methods, and they have good safety programs, and they have people watching, but there are still accidents that happen. Most of the time due to slip of the mind, carelessness, night after night after night after night, doing your job. multiple times. You take shortcuts. And so Mr. Giddings did. He took the shortcut route, and he got too close to the edge, and he went into a zone where the blast from pivoting aircraft going to the catapult blew him over to the side. Over the side, into the water. Dark. This was in the Tonkin Gulf in 1968. Now, deck crews, and remember, there might be 200 people working on that flight deck at that time, and 30 airplanes turning up.
Yes, sir.
But they threw life preservers. It's too late, the ship's moving, for the life preservers thrown in the front. But Mr. Giddings was blown over up near the catapults forward in the front, forward to the island. The ship moved on by. People on the aft deck, over on the right, starboard side, threw about 25 or 30 life preservers immediately.
Yes, sir.
Everybody that had one took them over quickly, threw them into the dark. And Giddings happened to float by and catch one. Of course, there was probably 30 to 40 thrown out there. And he caught a hold of one. And during flight operations, the helicopter, the air sea rescue helicopter, is always airborne. In case an airplane crashes on takeoff. Crashes. So the helicopter happened to already be airborne with their searchlight. So they just swung over along behind the ship, and there's Mr. Giddings in the big spotlight waving, and the air sea rescue helicopter, rather than picking up pilots and navigators, picked up technician Giddings.
Yes, sir.
Who had gotten blown over the side in the dark.
Yes, sir.
16,000 miles from home. And they picked him up and they brought him back up. We later gave Mr. Giddings a survival medal. We won't discuss it here. We tied it around his neck and made him wear it for about a week, even when he took a shower. So that he remember in the future, don't cut the corners.
Yes, sir.
We like Mr. Giddings. It was funny when it was all over. It was frightening at the moment.
Yes, sir.
Because he was a good guy, and he was just ambitious in his work, and he was very conscientious, and he was in a hurry, and he was learning how.
Yes, sir.
Fortunately, he survived. That was funny.
Yes, sir.
It's amazing what becomes funny to you when you are far from home under hostile conditions.
Yes, sir.
So Mr. Giddings was a survivor of the Vietnam conflict, though he never got shot at.
Yes, sir.
But he was rescued at sea.
Yes, sir. Well, after your service ended, what did you do? Did you go back to work? Or?
Yes. After my contract was up, that's what officers had, and my contract was a total of approximately 5.5 years. I elected not to continue on active duty, but to return to civilian life and to commence my employment with the oil and gas industry as a petroleum engineer.
Yes, sir.
And so my wife, that you see the photograph of right here, she and I had been married 2 years before I ever went into the Navy. We were students together at Louisiana State University. She was a 4-year student there at Louisiana State University. And she is Navy at heart. She was Navy at heart then. She is Navy at heart today. Margaret Ann. But we discussed it and we elected to go ahead and return to civilian life and commence our engineering employment, in the oil and gas industry. And I did so beginning out of Houma in South Louisiana in the offshore drilling industry, on drilling rigs.
Yes, sir.
As a drilling engineer for the Hunt Oil Company, Mr. H.L. Hunt, an oil man of those days.
Well, did you, during your service, did you make any close friendships that you may still continue
Yes.
today?
Yes, I certainly had many friendships,
Yes, sir.
but very transitory circumstances, many in training that I don't ever see again because they went to other squadrons, other units,
Yes, sir.
other places. But I would say that, I'm going to say, when we say the word close, I mean very close personally, not necessarily because of long periods of time.
Yes, sir.
There may not have only been but a few months, or maybe a few years there. But more so because of the comradeship with these people. I would say there were at least 40. There were at least 40 that I could recite their names and something about them and something of specific involvement that I had association with them.
Yes, sir.
And some of them over time we tend to forget maybe where they lived or what their first name was, like Mr. Giddings. I remember now, I think it was Mark, but he was always Airman Giddings to me, and I was Lieutenant Peavy to him, but I definitely remember Mr. Giddings. But of the men that I flew with in my squadron during those years, a matter of fact, I made two long deployments, one to Southeast Asia and one to the Mediterranean Sea.
Yes, sir.
But many of those men, for many years, I give them a call on the telephone. My commanding officer, I thought the world of him, and he was, you can't say he's like a father, but he was the age of my mother, and he was maybe like a big brother. You cannot call your commanding officer a brother. I mean, it's not that kind of a relationship. It's a formal relationship. Always is formal. That is the way we kept it.
Yes, sir.
Because of the circumstances we might find ourselves. But he and other flight crew and many of the enlisted personnel that worked in maintenance department, I grew to greatly appreciate and respect them. I was older than most of them.
Yes, sir.
Though they were working for me. But I come to appreciate them and their skill and their expertise. And yes, at least 40.
Yes, sir. Well, have you been involved in any veterans organizations?
Yes, I have. Certainly there are a number of, I don't know, 5 or 6, perhaps more, but at least 5 or 6 well-known in the United States veterans organizations or veteran service organizations. And some of them have emphasis on one area of support for its members or another area of interest to the community, support for the community. And all of them have a very good missions and goals and services to the community and to their members and to people who are not members in many places. But I am a member of the American Legion.
Yes, sir.
The American Legion is a primary and a key and a foremost and a forefront service organization or prior military personnel.
Yes, sir.
Organized sometime around 1919 after World War I ended. And I'm a member of that. I was not in World War I.
Yes, sir.
I'm a much younger member. But I am a member of the American Legion, and as you had asked, I brought just to demonstrate my cover. I'm in the Louisiana Department of the American Legion, and I am a member of Post 170,
Yes, sir.
which is Gina. The post located in Gina, that's been around for, I don't know, since back in the 1930s.
Yes, sir.
And there's many good men and good women that are members of the American Legion nationwide. So there are certainly some others, well-known ones in our community. Veterans of Foreign Wars, which is very large and very prominent.
Yes, sir.
And sponsor many of our parades and things. And I definitely encourage people to participate in one service organization or the other.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you, Granddaddy, for sharing.